Could frail wooden vessels, outsized by a millionaire's pleasure craft, truly condemn 6,000 Japanese soldiers to a watery grave in a single, desperate night? This is the suppressed chronicle of America's clandestine weapon, a force that taught Japan to tremble at the very darkness it once commanded. The Japanese destroyer's searchlights sliced across the inky abyss of the Solomon Sea, a harbinger of doom. For a heart-stopping moment, a brilliant beam seared the water perilously close to our bow, making the very sea shudder in a silver-sheened terror, yet by a miracle, it found no purchase. We were statues of flesh and bone. 23 sailors, their bodies fused to the deck of PT-164, held their breath, their hearts a frantic drumbeat against the sudden silence as the engines died to a whisper. Only the soft sigh of waves against Plywood stood between us and oblivion. Lurking behind the colossal destroyer, 3 monstrous transports crept through the obsidian blackness, their holds teeming with nearly 8,000 Japanese soldiers. Their target, Columbangara. Their objective to bolster an island garrison already draining the lifeblood of the American Marines. The date was July 19, 1943. In a fleeting 4 minutes, this delicate wooden shell, dwarfed by a millionaire's yacht, would seal the destiny of thousands. The odds were a cruel joke. The Japanese Navy was the undisputed sovereign of the night. Their sailors, virtuosos of the Tokyo Express, expertly wove men and material past our formidable heavy cruisers with insolent ease. Our only answer was a fragile defense of mahogany planks, capricious Packard engines, and torpedoes with a mind of their own. Yet on this night, fueled by sheer audacity, a trio of PT boats would dare to defy the impossible. Every soul aboard was acutely aware of the stakes. To fail was to cede Columbangara. To succeed was to send the enemy's transports to a silent, watery grave, ensuring thousands of soldiers would never again feel the solid ground of that contested island. We were phantoms on the water, ethereal spectres cloaked in the moon's silvery embrace, awaiting the singular command to unleash a maelstrom of destruction. But how could such humble wooden craft ever hope to challenge the might of steel leviathans? How did America's most improbable secret weapon compel Japan to cower before the very darkness they had once mastered? To unravel this mystery, we must journey back to the very inception of the legendary Mosquito Fleet. To grasp how these fragile wooden boats could strike terror into the heart of the world's most disciplined navy, we must rewind time. To the fateful summer of 1943, the Pacific War teetered on a razor's edge. The night still belonged to Japan. Their destroyers and transports navigated the treacherous gauntlet of the Solomon Islands with a practiced, almost arrogant ease. These relentless supply runs had earned a name, the Tokyo Express. To the wary American ears, it was simply the Rat Run. Regardless of the name, the outcome was brutally consistent. Each evening, under the cloak of darkness, a fresh wave of Japanese reinforcements and supplies flooded the contested islands. Come dawn, they would melt away into the dense jungle strongholds, leaving the embattled American Marines to face an ever renewed and well-armed foe. The American admirals were at a loss. Our cruisers and destroyers, magnificent in open ocean combat, were clumsy giants in these constricted, treacherous channels. Radar provided a glimpse into the darkness, but it couldn't bestow the agility needed to counter the enemy's swift maneuvers. Every gunnery duel in those confined waters only served to bolster the Japanese confidence. The disastrous Battle of Savo Island in August 1942, where 4 Allied cruisers were lost in a single night, without inflicting a single scratch on the Imperial Navy, was a brutal testament to their nocturnal supremacy. The lesson was seared into the American consciousness in the darkness. The rising sun was supreme. The United States desperately needed a new strategy, a new weapon, something utterly unexpected. Not another steel behemoth to trade blows with the Japanese fleet, but a revolutionary weapon that would completely rewrite the rules of naval warfare. The answer emerged from the crucible of desperation and ingenuity. In clandestine boatyards from the bustling ports of New Orleans to the industrial heart of New York, a radical, almost heretical, question was posed. What if victory wasn't about armor? What if speed, surprise, and sheer audacity could triumph over brute force? From this audacious gamble, the Patrol Torpedo boat was born, a sleek 80-foot vessel of laminated mahogany, a mere 20 feet wide, powered by 3 roaring Packard 500-horsepower engines, born from the same lineage as the formidable aircraft engines that ruled the skies. Armed with 4 massive Mark 13 torpedoes, each weighing as much as a small house, and a bristling array of machine guns and a 20mm cannon, all packed into a cramped wooden hull with the courage of a dozen men. To the traditionalist admirals, steeped in the grand naval battles of Jutland and Manila Bay, the PT boats were a laughable absurdity. They were dismissed as mere toys, wholly unfit for the grim reality of modern warfare. But a few visionaries like Commander James, Wild Jim, Patterson saw their true potential. He championed the idea of a new kind of naval warfare, one fought by guerrillas of the sea, hit-and-run raiders, and assassins armed with torpedoes. These were boats that would forsake the established rules of engagement, fighting not with fairness, but with cunning and lethal intelligence. It was a revolutionary departure from naval doctrine, the hallowed tradition of battleships exchanging thunderous salvos across the horizon was, by 1943, a recipe for disaster. The brutal reality of the Pacific demanded innovation. For the Japanese, their mastery of night combat was the very cornerstone of their naval strategy. Generations of their sailors were meticulously trained to fight in the darkness, guided by the pale light of the moon, by instinct, and by an uncanny, raw vision. Their confidence in the night was absolute, and they viewed the American reliance on radar as a crutch, a sign of weakness. They were convinced that no enemy could ever match their skill in the nocturnal battlefield. But then, the first unsettling whispers began to circulate. Reports of elusive American Mosquito boats, tiny, incredibly fast, and seemingly impossible to track, striking like phantoms in the night, like venomous cobras emerging from the inky black water. At first, the Imperial Navy dismissed these rumors as fanciful tales. The very notion of wooden speedboats challenging their steel destroyers was preposterous. But by the summer of 1943, that preposterous notion was about to tear through the very fabric of their confidence. This was the volatile world into which the PT boats were unleashed. A world where tradition had become a liability, and where 3 fragile wooden boats were about to prove that even the mightiest of empires could be brought to its knees in the darkest of nights. The first time American sailors laid eyes on a PT boat, many were convinced the Navy had lost its collective mind. No steel armor, no imposing cannons, just 80 feet of laminated mahogany and plywood in a war dominated by steel. It seemed more like a racing boat than a warship. Yet, concealed within that delicate hull was a revolution in naval warfare. The design was born in the clandestine secrecy of American boatyards. Higgins Industries in New Orleans, Elko and Bayonne, New Jersey, and Packard in Detroit. Factories that once produced luxurious pleasure crafts and high-end engines were now churning out weapons that would shatter naval tradition. They were officially designated as Patrol Torpedo boats, or PT for short, but to the men who built them and sailed them into the heart of the storm, they were the Mosquito Fleet. Small, lightning-fast, and deadly, capable of stinging giants in the dark. At the heart of each PT boat were 3 powerful Packard V-12 engines, essentially aircraft power plants repurposed for the sea, each one roaring with 500 horsepower. Together they could propel the boat across the waves at an astonishing 45 knots, faster than most destroyers could even turn their guns. The noise was a deafening roar, the vibration a constant tremor through every plank. But when the throttles were opened, a PT boat didn't just move, it leaped across the water. The armament was brutally simple 4 Mark 13 torpedoes, each 21 inches wide and 11 feet long, weighing 200 pounds, a weapon designed for destroyers now precariously lashed to the deck of a wooden boat. Machine guns lined the sides twin, 50 calibers that spat a stream of fire into the night, and a single 20mm cannon for an extra sting. It was just enough to harass a giant long enough for the torpedoes to deliver the final, devastating blow. But the firepower was only half of the story. The other half was the men. The Navy called for volunteers for hazardous duty with casualty rates exceeding 50%. 200 men stepped forward, and only 40 were chosen. They were a motley crew of farm boys, city kids, college graduates, and dropouts, men who had fished rivers, built engines, and navigated by the stars. They came not for glory, but for the promise of action. Their training was a brutal baptism by fire. At Melville, Rhode Island, they learned to fight like pirates, mastering high-speed torpedo runs in treacherous seas, calculating firing solutions by instinct, and tuning their engines under the relentless pressure of simulated battle. Commander James, Wild Jim, Patterson instilled in them a single, unwavering lesson: the Japanese expect you to fight fair. Don't. They expect you to follow tradition. Don't. They expect you to fear the dark. Make them afraid instead. Slowly, the crews began to understand their unique role. A PT boat wasn't a destroyer, it was an assassin, a guerrilla fighter on the water. Strike fast, disappear even faster, and hit the enemy where they least expected it. Each crew became a family. 12 men packed into close quarters, sharing bunks, rations, and the constant fear that bound them together. They learned each other's habits: who snored, who prayed before battle, who laughed too loud in the face of death. The bonds forged on those wooden decks were stronger than any steel. Engineers like Carlos, Charlie, Mendoza coaxed impossible power from the Packard engines. Mathematicians like Dutch Vandenberg calculated firing angles in mere seconds. Gunners like Patty, O'Brien polished each torpedo as if it were a precious gem. Every man, every skill was vital. On a larger ship, a sailor could be lost in the crowd. On a PT boat, there was nowhere to hide. By the spring of 1943, the boats, the crews, the engines, and the doctrine were all ready. The Navy, still skeptical, quietly dispatched them to the South Pacific. They were officially classified as small craft, barely mentioned in official reports. Even to their own side, the PT boats were a well-guarded secret. But secrets, as the Japanese were about to discover, have a power all their own. They still believed they owned the night, unaware that a swarm of wooden ghosts was coming for them. Boats that could slip through the shadows, strike like thunder, and vanish before a destroyer could even turn. The Mosquito Fleet was born, and soon the Imperial Navy would learn the painful lesson that even an empire could bleed from 1,000 tiny stings. On June 30th, 1943, at the forward base of Wendover, little more than a fuel dump and a few huts huddled under palm fronds, the men of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 9 prepared for their mission. 12 PT boats, 12 wooden daggers aimed at the heart of the Tokyo Express, were tasked with intercepting Japanese reinforcements moving through the Central Solomons. On paper, it was a simple plan: patrol the waters and sink anything flying the rising sun. In reality, it was a descent into chaos, a maze of treacherous reefs, jungle-shrouded islands, and a network of enemy coast watchers with radios in every village stood between them and their target. The first patrol on July 5th ended in disaster. A Japanese float plane spotted their wakes, and moments later, 4 destroyers thundered down upon them, their searchlights blazing. PT-158 took a direct hit, and 12 men vanished in an instant. The survivors fled through the reefs for hours, their engines screaming, their hearts pounding in their chests. The lesson was brutal: they couldn't fight like destroyers. They had to fight like ghosts. The days that followed were a blur of restless activity. Engines were tuned, guns were polished, and torpedoes were meticulously checked and rechecked. The crews drilled in silence, communicating with flashes of light, cutting their engines to drift in the shadows, honing their tactics out of sheer necessity. Life at the base was a raw existence of spam, powdered eggs, and coffee black enough to float a wrench. Saltwater showers left their skin burning, and mosquitoes were a constant torment. Yet their morale held steady, for they were part of something different, something secret, something that could change the course of the war. They became a brotherhood, sharing their fears, their stories, and their dark humor in the flickering light of lanterns. And they were not alone. Solomon Islanders, risking their lives, paddled out in canoes to provide scraps of vital intelligence. And far away, unseen, Australian coast watchers relayed coded messages, their ghostly voices whispering enemy movements into the night. Then, on July 18th, the briefing came. A major convoy was moving through Blackett Strait. The squadron leader's words were clear. "Gentlemen, this convoy cannot reach its destination. I don't care if you have to ram those transports. They go to the bottom tonight." As the sun bled into the horizon, the crews prepared, each man with his own ritual, each man carrying his own fear. At 20:30, they slipped their lines and headed into the darkness. At 23:47, the radio crackled with a coast watcher's voice. 3 large ships, bearing 280, speed 18 knots, range 15 miles. The hunt was on. Midnight, July 20th, 1943. 3 PT boats drifted in the darkness off the coast of Vella La Vella, their engines idling, their crews waiting. Then, shapes on the horizon. 2 destroyers in the lead, 3 transports lumbering behind, another destroyer guarding the rear. They moved in perfect formation, confident, unaware of the trap that was about to be sprung. Lieutenant Commander Arthur Mac Macpherson whispered the audacious plan. 2 boats would strike from the flanks, while his boat would charge straight up the middle, through the needle's eye, between 2 steel giants. It was madness, but it was a madness the Japanese would never expect. At 1,000 yards, the order came. 3 clicks on the radio. The PT boats leaped forward, their engines roaring to life, their bows lifting out of the water, spray exploding around them as they charged at 40 knots into the jaws of the enemy. Searchlights blazed, and the Japanese lookouts reeled in shock. The PT boats were already inside their formation, too close for the big guns, too fast for the search crews to track. Chief Petty Officer Tom Harrigan's twin. A 50 caliber spat Fury, tracers slashing across the bridge of a destroyer. Fire 1. Fire 2. Patty O'Brien's torpedoes leaped from their tubes, their white wings carving through the black water. The first torpedo slammed into a transport, the sea erupting in thunder and flames. The second struck midships, and the ship broke its back, spilling thousands of soldiers into the sea. Behind them, PT-168 launched a spread, striking the second transport, which was loaded with ammunition. The blast turned night into day, a rolling fireball raining molten steel and burning bodies across the water. Chaos consumed the convoy. Destroyers wheeled desperately, firing wildly, but they faced an impossible choice: fire and risk hitting their own, or hold fire and watch their transports die. As one destroyer turned to ram PT-164, Mac shoved the throttles past their stops, and the boat pivoted in a desperate arc, escaping annihilation by a mere 10 feet. PT-171 was less fortunate. Pinned by a searchlight, its hull ripped through by tracers, it was forced to break off, trailing smoke. "Launch the rest and get us out," Mac ordered. 2 more torpedoes thundered into the water, but the last transport turned, and they slid harmlessly past. The Mosquito boats fled, zigzagging through curtains of fire, the sea burning behind them, 2 transports sinking, thousands of soldiers drowning. By dawn, the outcome was clear. The convoy was broken. For the men of the Mosquito Fleet, survival was victory enough. But the cost was real. In the weeks that followed, more boats were lost, more men were killed. Yet, for every boat lost, the enemy blood destroyers, transports, and barges, and thousands of troops who would never reach the battlefield. The survivors carried the scars of that night, both visible and invisible. The memory of burning ships, the screams of drowning men, the constant fear that haunted their dreams. But they had changed the war. The story of the Mosquito Fleet became a legend, a testament to the power of innovation, audacity, and the courage of free men in fragile vessels to change the tide of history. And the Japanese, who had once owned the night, now feared the darkness, for they knew that in the shadows, the mosquitoes were waiting.